beloved, and welcome to Our Whole Lives Taking Flight webinar. My name is Reverend Amy Johnson. I am the Minister for Sexuality, Education, and Justice in the United Church of Christ, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you here with us today. With me is my dear friend and colleague, Melanie Davis. Will you introduce yourself?
Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I am Dr. Melanie Davis. I am the Unitarian Universalist Association's Our Whole Lives Program Manager. And we are delighted to welcome our guest today, every sex educator's friend, Cory Silverberg. Cory, would you like to introduce yourself further?
Sure. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Cory. Should I just say a little bit and you're going to talk some more? Or okay. So I'm a sex educator and have been lucky enough to I've lived in lots of different places, and so in many of those places got to come and visit OWL programming, which has been great. And so yeah, I live in Toronto, Canada, and today was my kid's first day of school, so I'm a little lightheaded, but happy to be here.
Thanks, Cory. And we're going to hear more from Cory in just a minute. We are excited to have them here today to talk about the books that they have written, and particularly the new one, You Know Sex. So before we get started, I'm going to open us up with a reading by one of my favorite poets, Shalane Harkin. And this is from her book, Let Us Dance, The Stumble and Whirl with the Beloved. You can see all my papers flying out of it. I got all these dog-eared pages on here, but this is my favorite poem of hers, and she has granted me permission to use it. It's called Origin Story, and I think I may have read it on another Taking Flight. There is a God who made the clitoris and extreme pleasure. Let's not marginalize those facts. There's a God who made honey and nectar and pollen and bees who live their whole lives practicing high levels of PDA with flowers. Let's not forget that either. There's a God who made all humans originate from a beautiful Black woman in the heart of Africa. No need to whitewash that. There's a God who made hips that respond to music. I mean, that wasn't an accident, right? There's a God who made a system for each being to be created from the great act of love and pleasure. Can our toilsome ways remember those origins? Consider this poem a short sermon to allow the vibrant, fertile wholeness of our truth back in, to let our inherent God-given verve back in to sauce up our souls. I think if we became a little less selectively forgetful and let ourselves remember all of this, church would get a whole lot more interesting.
Thank you for sharing that, Amy. Before we get started with our formal program, I'd like to mention two things. One, to congratulate you on your ordination recently. A lot of our guests today might not be aware that you were ordained in the UCC Church. So blessings to you on that. And the other thing is that I would like, since we have so many program coordinators in our audience, to let them know that we are back in business with in-person OWL facilitator trainings. We had 11 trainings across the country and online in August. So if folks want to keep an eye on Amy's calendar for OWL trainings and the UUA calendar for OWL trainings, they're happening, folks. So.
Should I start?
I was just going to say, I was typing a response to somebody in the chat. So here we are, just being real and human right out of the gate this morning, all of us here. So Cory, over to you. What do you have for us today? We'd love to hear what you have to share.
Sure. And so I'll also just say, so there's a Q&A function, and you can chat. The chat is not open for everyone. The chat is just, you can communicate with Amy and Melanie and Andrea. I guess so if you have technical questions or questions for them. But if you have questions for me or things you just want to raise, use the Q&A function. I'm not good at doing two things at once, so I'm not going to pay attention to any of it. But then I'm also not going to talk for that long. because I'm much more interested, and I'll share this is how our books are written. I'm much more interested in having conversations than hearing myself talk. So thanks everyone for coming. This is, I also say, as I mentioned, it's like my kid started grade 3 today, and I had a really bad experience with school. So, and no one told me that like being a parent is just like constantly being triggered. Or having kids that you love in your life. You actually don't have to be a parent, just constantly like these things are happening to them and they're happening to you. So I'm a little shaky, but I think it'll be, we'll get through it because we're here together. So what I thought I would do is just talk a little bit about our book. So myself and Fiona Smith have made these 3 books. We plan on making more. And then read a couple chapters from the newest book, which is called You Know Sex. But then, as I said, really leave a lot of time to talk. So I want to just tell you a few things about the books in general. So first of all, the first thing to know is like our books are written from a kind of a deeply non-expert perspective. So I'm very wary of people who use the word expert about themselves. I'll just be honest. Some people do it, and it's different. You know, that falls on different people differently, because some of us are have to take up that space in a different way, depending on what we look like and how people treat us. So I guess I'm for the strategic use of that term. But when it comes to sex education, the thing is that there's a couple of reasons why I don't think it helps. One thing is that like most questions about sex that people have, young people, I was gonna say particularly young people, but it's actually true for all people. Most of our questions aren't about like biomedicine. Most of our questions are not about how is a baby made, how do I not get pregnant, how do I not get a disease. Those are questions that adults want young people to know about, and so we talk about them a lot. But most of our questions are relational. They're about community, they're about culture, they're about our bodies, which are not objective and universal facts. They are alive and changing all the time. And so the fact is that like, I'm not the person to give people answers, right? The really important questions, I don't have the answers for people. What I'm really good at is kind of cultivating curiosity. I'm very good at making people feel comfortable talking about things that they've been told all their lives they should feel uncomfortable talking about. And to be honest, part of that is because I'm uncomfortable most of the time, which has a lot to do with my gender. I'm not uncomfortable talking about sex. I love talking about sex, but I'm actually uncomfortable talking about like, I don't know, anything else really. So our books are written from a fundamentally different place, and people who read our books get that. And it's sometimes, you know, because the information is often like similar in that we talk about anatomy and we talk about boundaries and consent, but they feel different. And part of the reason they feel different is because we start with this basic message. And so the newest book, which is called You Know Sex, so it's like this. The title is there for a reason, because because the fact is that we all know a lot about sex. 6-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 52-year-olds, which is my age, know a lot about sex. We may not know that it has to do with sex, but like we all have lived in our bodies our whole lives, right? And whether that's 10 years or 60 years, it's a long time, right? To have lived in your body your whole life, and you have knowledge, and you probably also have some wisdom too. But the way that we teach sex is often like, this is a thing you haven't been taught about. So I'm gonna come in as the friendly teacher, parent, older sibling, and I'm gonna teach you what you need to know. And it's in there, and the fact is it's actually quite a disempowering way to start. So where we start is that you actually know things, and we foreground that. And the way we foreground that, as I'll show you when I'm reading, is through questions. Because of course, in a situation, so we're in a webinar, so I can't see you and we're not really interacting, but when I get to be in person with people, or even in the other formats, it can be more of a conversation, and I can pick up on people's energy, and it's more of a back and forth. A book is kind of like what I'm doing now, which is I have no idea what the reader is going through. So the way that we do it in our books is by asking a lot of questions. So there's 3 books right now. So we started with this book called What Makes a Baby, which is this book about where babies come from. That was, when it came out, the first book that was inclusive of trans families. And as it turns out, it was also actually the first book that worked for like adoptive families and single parent families for reproduction, because there were already a bunch of books about how you make a family, like how did books for the child about how did you come into our family. But annoyingly, the sex education piece was always like the books about sex education, the books about where babies come from that were sex ed, meaning like reproduction, like gestation, reproduction, birth. They were all, you have a mom, you have a dad, sperm came from your dad, the egg came from your mom. It was very easy for them to make you. They tried once and it happened. Everybody was happy and loving and everything's great, which I think we all know that that's not actually how it goes for most of us. We wrote this book that's for kind of, kids 4 and up, that's about where babies come from. And then we wrote a second book called Sex is a Funny Word, which very importantly didn't touch on reproduction. And we wrote that book because what I noticed in sex education was that we tend to do this thing with kids, which is we tell them about where babies come from, and then we tell them about puberty. And the age at which kids are curious about where babies come from can be anywhere from like 3 to 6 or 7 or 8. And for a lot of kids, puberty starts at 10, maybe a little bit earlier, but there's like a couple years in there where there weren't books for kids that encourage them to think about what I think of as sexuality, right? So that means boundaries and touch, not sexual touch, but just touch, friendships, feelings, like warm feelings and cold feelings or difficult feelings, all of that stuff, our bodies and how they're changing. We tell all sorts of things that aren't true about physical development. Like, so for example, we often talk about puberty as the time when your hormones change, but anyone who's spent a lot of time with young kids or anyone who's survived through puberty knows that actually we go through hormonal fluctuations many, many times in our lives. And it's very apparent that we go through these times when we have a hard time self-regulating, when we can go up and down very quickly. But for some reason, we only focus on puberty. So we wanted to change that with Sex is a Funny Word. And then with the new one, Sex, it is for puberty age kids. It's a very big book. So it's actually 432 pages because it turns out there was a lot to say. And I'm going to show you some of that book. And if folks want, we can talk about the other books if you have particular ages you're interested in, like how do you deal with, if you are curious about how we sort of address a certain subject at a certain age. The second 2 books, not the first one, the second 2 books do very specifically deal with sexual abuse and violence. In the 3rd book, there's a chapter on violence and harassment and abuse, and there's also a chapter on trauma. So that's, again, sort of important for us. That's, part of the job, part of the work that we're trying to do is make sex a part of everyday conversation. And so that requires us to be talking about other things when we talk about sex, right? So often people think like the sex education lesson is going to be about the penis or the clitoris or something, and they might be surprised when a sex education lesson is about race, right? Starts with a conversation that's kind of about race and sexism, it's about our bodies and how we live in the world. Let me say a few more things about the books in general before I kind of share. I'll share my screen and show you some of the book. All of the books decenter sort of gender normative and heteronormative experience and normative bodies. So I use that language very specifically because they are books like I'm queer. And the truth is, like, I write these books for kind of queer kids in a way, but I'm also very, it takes years. It took 7 years to write this last one. Very particular to make sure that the books can be for all kids. So they are as much for like a kid that fits really nice, really comfortably in the binary, who's already expressing super straight feelings, as it does for a queer kid who's maybe non-binary or who's sort of exploring their gender in a particular way. So instead of writing a book, and we need these, I should say, we need many more books. So if any of you are interested in writing books for kids about sex and gender, we need so many more. And including books that are really geared to specific kind of identities. But this book doesn't do that. What we do instead is we sort of take the gender normative and heteronormative experience out of the center. And so the books look very messy, which is kind of how I think of sex and gender being. Right, okay, so there's that. What else do I want to say? I think the other thing I want to say, I was actually someone was sharing with me a book that they really liked that was, and I'm going to forget the name of it, but it's by these 2 people. Sorry, now I've forgotten all of it. But, and the information was good, but it did the thing that I think a lot of sex education books do that, we don't do, which is we don't say that sex is about to be scary. We say that it's complicated and it's confusing, but we don't start this kind of conversation. Like, again, there is no older sibling who's saying like, don't worry, I got you. I'm going to help you through this. And so it's just a different choice. right? Because I actually don't want anyone thinking that there's one person who has all the answers, because we know there isn't, right? So that choice to have that character can be very comforting and really work for some people, and it just isn't the way we did it. Instead, we sort of start with this message that kids know a lot, that they don't know everything, but they know a lot. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen now. No, I got to do this other thing first.
While you're doing that, Cory, I hope people realize that your method is so in sync with our whole lives, because our facilitators are trained not to teach, this is the truth, but rather to help participants explore what has meaning for them. So I'm so glad that we are able to incorporate your books into our recommendations.
Yes, and I know that, like, in lots of congregations that they do, or well, I guess that you don't call them, just in lots of owl groups.
It's UU congregations and UCC churches.
Okay. So I know lots of groups that do use the books, and I'll also share that, like, because I really write these books for kids, and because I know they're now getting used in public and private schools, and I do know that they get used in OWL sometimes. So it's in my mind, but it's primarily, I'm thinking about them as being read by kids. So in my experience, and I'm happy that most people kind of just use parts, right? They're like, this is useful. Because the truth is that some of the questions that we ask may not feel comfortable or actually be safe in a really mixed group. With OWL, it's different because you often have kids that are together for a while. As you know, it's like the things that you guys do is so special and so unique, right? So there's just in the States and even in Canada, there's just not a lot of spaces where kids get to have this kind of learning in spaces that are about this kind of learning, right? That are, they get, like in Canada, they get some forms of sex education, but they're in this classroom that is not usually so nourishing. So anyway, yes, thank you. I'm glad. I know that about OWL. I should say, of course, I've been familiar with OWL for a long time, and whenever I start a new book, then I kind of look at, like, the literature that's available, and OWL is always there. So I'm going to read to you a chapter that's from early in the book, and part of what we're doing is not just giving this kind of concrete information about bodies or gender or boundaries, but helping kids think about what it means to learn, right? So this is a chapter that's early on. It's called That Time You Learned About Sex. And the way the books work is that they're a mix of comics and kind of narrative. So it starts off with a comic, and what we're going to see is the four main characters plus a few more, and we're going to see them learning about sex. So the comic's called That Time You Learned About Sex. And I'm going to read them and also describe a little bit. So on the left is a panel, and we see Cooper, who's one of our main characters, and he's looking at a computer or a laptop, and we see the reflection of a bum or butt, bum. In Canada, we say bum. Butt is what they say in the States. In his glasses. So he's probably looking at some sexy pictures. And we see there's sort of like these lines that he's having some experience. We don't know if it's like good or bad. In the next panel, we see Mimi, and she's on the couch with her dads, and they're watching TV, and a commercial comes on, and we see that the commercial says, heavy flow tampons. And Mimi's eyes go wide, and she's thinking to herself, periods. In the next panel, there's a new character named Lisa, and she's walking to school, and she has this shirt with these big cherries, these sort of juicy cherries on them, and there's two kids that are laughing at her, and she doesn't know why. In the next panel is Zai, who's another main character, and Zai's in a movie theater, and they're overseeing this conversation, probably between a boyfriend and a girlfriend, and we see that he has his hand on her shoulder, and he says, I want to see Killer Clowns 5. If you loved me, you'd see the movie I want to see. And she says, no way. In the next panel is Omar, and he's at a comic book store, and he's found this thing he's very excited about. He says, amazing, Warrior Zhang in the original box. And he's completely oblivious that beside him, there's a young girl who has also found something she's very excited about, which is Omar. And in the last panel, it's a mother and a daughter, and the daughter is saying, but Mom, you never tell Ethan what to wear. And the mom says, Ethan is your older brother. Boys are different. And then the text begins. There we go. People treat sex like it's a mystery. Before we figure it out, we're innocent little kids. Once the mystery is revealed, we transform into knowledgeable and cool adults. But that's not how it works. We start learning about sex way before puberty, and we never stop learning about it. Learning about sex is more than just learning about where babies come from and how not to get a disease. And so now we're going to see a page where we're going to follow a character through. Learning about sex means discovering things you like to do, things that bring you joy, and finding people you want to do them with. It means figuring out where and how you fit in the world. All of this takes time, but you don't just start learning about yourself or sex during puberty. You already know a lot about who you are. You have things you like and dislike. You have people you want to hang out with and others you want to avoid. And on this, the right panel, we see that there are these two kids walking who are kind of gothy, walking down the hallway, and these two girls are saying, wow, and kind of giving attitude. Everything can change as you discover new things about yourself. Some of these discoveries may have always been inside you. Others might be new. And now we see the character meeting someone at hot yoga. And now we're going to see follow Mimi through a day. There will always be people who think they know us better than we know ourselves. And here Mimi's in a guidance counselor's office, and the guidance counselor is saying, it's common for kids who are adopted to feel like, and Mimi says, but that's not how I feel. They think they know us because of our age, where we're from, the color of our skin, how we dress, and what our body looks like. And here Mimi's in a math class and they've got their grades back, and this kid says, aren't you supposed to be good at math? And Mimi says, you realize you're being racist. They don't really know us, but they judge us as a good or bad person and act like everyone else should agree with their judgment. And here Mimi and Zai are now out, and they walk by this protest that says stop gay sex and stop the gay agenda. And the protester says, God says homosexuals are bad. And Mimi says, not my God. And now we're going to follow Omar a little bit. We can't avoid these people. Sometimes we're related to them, and they aren't all bad. Sometimes they notice things we hadn't noticed. Sometimes we learn from them too. And here Omar's with his grandmother, and she's saying, Omar, I know you'll be a great doctor. And Omar's like, but I don't want to be a doctor. And then they're cooking, and she says, Omar, you're a natural in the kitchen. And he says, I do enjoy eating it later. But no one ever knows more about you than you. You don't know everything about yourself, but you know more about you than anyone else. And Cooper says, you never told me you knew so much about cooking. Learning about sex means learning about who you are, and no one can do that better than you. And so at the end of every chapter, so it's this giant book, it's 432 pages, but they're broken up into very small chapters. And so the end of each chapter, there's questions. And so this is sort of really the kind of, I think the most important part of the book. And the questions are for the readers. And they could just be to answer by themselves or with a trusted adult or in a classroom setting. And so first there's this teacher who's basically me, who comes in and says, this is the first page with questions. Because sex is about our whole lives, the questions in this book are about our whole lives too. Look, it says our whole lives twice in that sentence. When you answer them, think about your whole life, including things you don't usually think of as being about sex. And I'll just sort of pause for a second and say, like, the way we make these books is, it took 7 years to make this book. I read them with lots and lots of kids and lots of adults. And this part came about because at first we weren't doing that. And we were asking very general questions, but because the word sex was on the cover of the book, kids were only answering those questions in the context of sex. So often they would say, like, I don't know, I haven't kissed someone, or I don't know, that hasn't happened. So I'll read the questions out and you'll see how these are questions that you could answer in many ways. Can you think of a time when someone treated you like you were clueless just because you were younger than me? How did it feel? Did you say anything? Can you think of a time when an adult in your life didn't know something or made what you thought was a bad decision? What are 3 things that no one knows about you? Are any of them things that you wish people did know? So this, what are 3 things that no one knows about you, is a classic example that, like, we all could probably answer that question. But if you think that the question is, what are 3 things about sex or gender that people don't know about you, it becomes a much heavier question to figure out how to answer. So before I go to the next chapter, I'll just say the other thing that we do throughout the book is that these comments, mostly these are created by Fiona, that are not necessarily informational, but they just, they sort of help us move from one subject to another, and sometimes from heavy subjects to lighter subjects, or lighter subjects to heavier subjects. So this is an example, and there's these 2 birds, and one of them says, did you know that noses and ears become erect? What? Where'd you get that piece of hot gossip? From Dad, and I read about it at the library. Who cares? We don't have those kinds of ears and noses. Well, I for one find it very fascinating. Okay, Professor, what else did you hear? That we're related to dinosaurs. Now you're talking. And so this is, it's an example of, I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. The tone of the book, when we started writing this book, people were really like, how are you ever going to get tweens? And they're so particular, and they're already kind of too cool for school, and how are you going to be the cool one or whatever? And I realized, you know, immediately I knew, well, I wasn't going to try to be cool because that's not who I am. And that actually, if you're just kind of consistent and you're a consistent sort of voice, and also if you write for young people with respect and you treat them as if they know stuff, they often will fall into the book. They often like it. But because of the age, you can also just be funny sometimes, right? So there's like this dinosaur joke, which I'm surprised how a lot of kids really like it. Okay, I'm gonna share one more chapter, and then I'm gonna stop at this portion. I just need to go. So this is about body autonomy, and I gotta, there we go. Okay. So this chapter begins, like all of them, with a comic. And so I'm just showing you the whole page, and then I'll break it up for you. And the kids are in an assembly. And so they're listening to this guy who's giving this talk, and this is what they hear. Blah, 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 respect yourself, and others will respect you. Blah, 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 just say no. Blah, blah, blah. We see some of them are actually sleeping, and then it's just a lot of blah, 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 blah. And what's happening is, as he's talking about body autonomy, he's giving this talk on body autonomy. It's a C word, I forgot, about body autonomy. They're all thinking about examples that don't fit in with what he's saying. So here on the left, Omar is remembering a time when he wanted to get a skateboard, and Omar uses crutches, and Omar's mother said, no, your legs aren't strong enough. So Omar's not being allowed to make a choice. And then on the right, Mimi's dads are saying, we don't care if Susie's mom said yes. You are too young to get your ears pierced. And then this other character is remembering a time when this teacher said, your clothes are a violation of our dress code. You'll have to go home and change. And Zai is remembering this time when their mom said, you are not going out with combat boots and lipstick. Don't cry me. And so this comic was really generated out of my experience with young kids about that we're always talking about body autonomy, and they don't, I mean, they have some of them have some, but there's all sorts of times when they don't. And it's a very strange thing in school, particular, to talk about body autonomy and not acknowledge, like in this institution where you're essentially, well, you're being institutionalized, you have very little body autonomy. And that's a thing we need to let kids think through and talk about. So then the chapter begins. Body autonomy is the idea that you get to make your own rules and set down your own boundaries for your body. Body autonomy, oh, and I should say, we talked about boundaries in a previous chapter, so that's not a new word for them. Body autonomy means that no one should force or pressure you to do something with your body, and you should never force or pressure someone else to do something with their body. Body autonomy is an example of a power we all have, the power to make our own rules. Having body autonomy doesn't mean everyone will respect our body autonomy, and it doesn't mean we always get to choose everything about our bodies, right? So this really comes from disability community. We're making this very clear distinction between you actually can make your own rules. It doesn't mean people are going to listen to them, but there's power in that. So for adults, it's often sometimes called choice within constraints. And so now the comic begins. Sometimes, to be safe, we don't get to decide what happens with our body. And so we're going to see this mother and child having this conversation. And the kid says, I don't need a helmet, it messes up my hair. And the parent says, you have to wear a helmet, I love your brain. Sometimes it's not about safety, it's about what other people need and expect. And so now the parent is saying, you also need to wear these knee pads, gloves, elbow mask, and face mask. And the kid's having a response. And we see these other kids also being like, what's going on over there? It's complicated, but when our body autonomy is being ignored or overruled, we can pay attention to it, listen to our instincts, and try to talk about it. And so we see this solution, which is the kid says, how about I wear Ryan's helmet? It's much cooler than the one you got me. And the parent says, I can live with that. As we get older, we may get more control over aspects of our body autonomy. But it isn't the same for everyone. Some bodies are treated as if they aren't as worthy of body autonomy as other bodies. And even if we have more control, people might still choose to ignore our body autonomy, which is wrong. Our body autonomy always matters. And so I'll share with you just a thing about sort of updating a sex education book is that, so we have a lot of social media throughout. And this was actually very much Fiona who picked up on this, is that because I had written this panel to be a scene where a kid is getting bullied and have their pants pulled down, and she immediately gave all these other kids cell phones. We all feel like we have times we're asked or told to do something with our body, and we feel like we can't say no. And so we're going to see these two examples. The teacher says, Brian, would you please come up to the front to present your project? And we see he's very stressed. And the other example is, Anya, everyone's getting a shot. Your parents signed their permission slip. It won't hurt much. Body autonomy is a reminder that even if we feel like we can't say no, we can try and say what our bodies want and need. And so Brian says, Ms. Perez, may I present from my desk? And the teacher says, yes, Brian, please proceed. And Anya says, Nurse Vanya, can I lie down for the shot? And the nurse says, yes, Anya, whatever makes you more comfortable, whatever makes this more comfortable for you. Sometimes individual people ignore our body autonomy. And so we see this example of Cooper with his sibling and his grandmother, and his grandmother says, Kevin can have dessert. Cooper, you don't eat it. Which is both a piece about body autonomy and a little piece about factophonia. Sometimes it's not a person who ignores our body autonomy. It can be a school, a hospital, or a government that removes our choices by making rules or laws that we have to follow. And so Zai is non-binary, and so they're looking at this men's and women's bathrooms. These rules and laws and all the things that follow them have a way of lifting some of us up and keeping some of us down. And so here we're seeing Mimi, who's adopted, doing some homework that says, understanding genetics through your family tree. Maternal grandparents, paternal grandparents, mother, father. So this is not going to work. Sometimes this is called segregation. And so then each panel is going to have an example. So Mimi says, why do they put the special ed classes in the basement? I never thought about it, but it's kind of messed up now that you pointed out. Sometimes it's called discrimination. And here the kids are in a clothing store and Mimi's in the background, and the sales clerk is focusing on Zai and their friend, who are both Black, and saying, excuse me, are you going to buy that? It's $350. And Zai said, we're just looking, thanks. Sometimes it's called criminalization. And here we have kids hanging out on a stoop and an adult and older person calling at the window, you kids don't belong here. I called the police. Segregation, discrimination, and criminalization are all examples of people and systems using power over us to limit our choices and body autonomy. Everybody deserves body autonomy, but for that to happen, everybody has to participate. Each of us needs to listen to and trust our instincts when we feel like our body autonomy is being disrespected, talk about what our bodies want and need, respect other people's body autonomy, pay attention and listen to what they are communicating about their bodies. Even if the world doesn't act this way, body autonomy is for everybody. And so then again, we're ending with a bunch of questions. Here, the questions are, can you remember a time when you knew what your body wanted and someone didn't listen to you? What did you do? Are there things happening to your body now that you don't like? Are there things about your body you wish you had more control over? Can you think of choices about your body that you have that other people don't have? What are some ways you could claim your body autonomy? Do you have people who help you imagine what body autonomy looks and feels like? And then at the end of some chapters, we also have activities. So this activity says, speaking up, like Brian and Anya do on page 75, isn't easy, and it takes practice. Think about a time when someone wasn't respecting your body autonomy and you wish you had said something. What do you wish you had said? If you have someone you trust, ask them if they can think of a time in their life when they wish they had spoken up. Try to come up with other things each of you could have said. Try saying it out loud and see how it feels. So that's it. And before I want us to start having a conversation, or I want to see if folks have questions, I'm going to just point out a couple things about comics and why comics are the best. I'm going to say this. I never say anything universal. I believe comics are the best format basically for every kind of education because they're so rich. So kids, a couple things I want to point out, and this is an interesting thing for you all to think about because you are in rooms, I guess virtual, but Nelson hopefully now in person. When you're creating sex education that's written, it's actually it's quite a gift because kids are often reading it on their own, and so there's a whole kind of performative layer that isn't there, right? So we're all performing for each other. I don't say performative in a negative way, but when we're in a classroom, I mean, right now I'm performing, right? And so I'm not exactly doing everything I want to do. And so when we're in a classroom, kids are in a classroom, they're thinking about the other kids, they're thinking about their teacher, they're thinking about what happened in the morning, all of this stuff. When you're alone with a book, there's just a kind of calmness that sometimes happens. And so the information can just be received in a different way. And I've certainly found this, like there was this sort of like, a lot of parents were like, how are you going to talk to kids this age? Because and I'm a parent, I struggle talking to my kid, but the answer is sort of, I'm not talking to them. I mean, I'm speaking to them in a different way, but I also have them in a situation which is almost completely private, but again, because there's this other voice, they can take information in. And the great thing about comics is there's information on so many levels. So to look at this page, and I don't know how clearly you can see it, you probably can't read the text, which is fine, but we did this thing where there's just like all this examples of activism, right? So there's student rights and Me Too and trans power and Mad Pride and something about sex work and something about HIV. And a lot of kids are going to just flip by this page and not take it in. And some kids are going to stop and read the text, and they might take in one or two things. And it's just this incredibly layered way of offering information. It's the same thing like with a page like this, where immediately we're seeing the kids are at school and then they're out of school. And for adults, it's interesting. I do read my drafts a lot with adults, and adults who aren't used to reading comics often find it very confusing and often say this is too much information. But kids who read comics don't, because they just have a comfort. What they have a comfort doing is reading an entire page, and they don't start a page and think like, where's the most important information? Whereas I did not grow up with comics. I read a lot now, but so I still do this thing about like, where, like in a page like, not this one, let me find a 4-panel, one more. In a page like this, my brain often goes, wait, am I supposed to read down or across? And my experience with like dozens and dozens of kids is that they just don't do that. And it's actually great because you know what the other thing is? They can read it in whatever order they want. It can, because and with sex education, of course, it is cumulative, like the order of our chapters. I'm sorry, I'm going to show you one other thing. They are cumulative, but in my experience, again, if a kid hits something they don't know, first of all, there's a glossary in the back, and then often they'll just go try to figure it out. And then of course, the other thing is if they have access to the internet, they often just look it up online. I did want to just show you one last thing before I stop sharing altogether. Which is, hold on, you know what, I'm just going to do thumbnails after we get there, just so you have a sense of what it is. So this is the table of contents. So we go from this kind of conversation about like, what is sex and what does it mean to learn sex? We do like anatomy, and the anatomy is done in a way that works for intersex bodies, for trans bodies, for disabled bodies, right? For non-binary bodies. So the anatomy, it happens in a certain order where they learn about anatomy, and sometimes it says like most bodies have this, like most bodies have a bum, and sometimes it says some bodies have this, some bodies have that, and sometimes we don't do that at all. Then there's a whole section on gender, identity, all this kind of stuff, pronouns. The puberty section is the biggest section, and the way that we've done that is we talk about the changes to expect. But on each page, so there's always these 2 pages, and there's like, here's the kind of changes. So like body hair, for example. So here are the changes you can expect, and there's like funny cartoons. And then the next page, it says advice from the other side. And those are actual quotes from adults about how they navigated and survived puberty. Then there's a whole section on feelings. So in there, that's where sexual orientation shows up, and crushes and love. And we talk about asexuality, and then the section on consent, which very much starts without any kind of sexual context. So there's there's many pages about consent in the classroom, and then the kind of example we use is spin the bottle. In the talking section, there's a section on stigma, which is actually mostly where we deal with HIV, and also on disclosure, which is a big thing for kids around identity stuff. And then there's a little bit about talking about having sex, because it's written, this book is really sort of for like 10 and up. I really didn't like I'll say there's one page that explains intercourse, anal sex, and oral sex. And it's there because I know that those are terms that kids hear, and so they should get a plain language definition of each of those. So that's like one page of 432 pages. So there's more on masturbation, and there's a whole chapter on kissing. But this is this thing that I had this person write about these books recently, and the thing that just came natural for me, it's just the way I do things, but that she found very unusual, is that there isn't a lot of sex in these books. Because also I want these books for people who may never have sex. I don't want the goal of this book to feel to anyone like, now you know stuff, and so therefore when you become an adult, you can have responsible sex. Because you need to have sex to be a responsible adult. Anyway, then there's a section on relationships, which includes a whole section on like non-monogamy and monogamy and polyamory. Reproduction, which includes all the IVF, IUI, etc. There's touching. So touching is like the sex section, but it's really like about like it's this one little section that sort of explains the actual things. There's a whole thing about kissing. There's a big chapter on pornography, which of course is really necessary now. And then the last section is on safety. And so we talk about power, harassment, and bullying. We use the language. Oh no, I'm forgetting her name, but it's language from another counselor and educator of secret touch, which is sexual abuse when it's targeted to young people. And there's a section on trauma. And then I'm going to end with this. There's one at the very end. There's this little thing about sexually transmitted infections. I didn't even want to put that in there. I didn't want to put it in there because if kids get sex education, that's what they get. And the other thing is, the other reason I didn't want to put it in there is I do not know how to do that in a way that isn't boring. It's because it's a lot of information, right? And when you're doing it with kids who maybe are not yet engaging in a lot of sexual activities, it just doesn't seem to connect. And I really didn't want to do the boring thing. And so for the next book, hopefully I'll figure out how to do it, right? Like, because like, the nice thing about what I'm doing is mostly like consent. It's very complicated, but it's also just like these chunks of information, right? So I don't have to start with a lecture. I have yet to figure out how to talk about like HPV in a way that doesn't kind of start with like because you need to know like there's just stuff you need to know to have it make sense. So there's a very short chapter on that because all my sex educator friends told me that I needed to put it in, and so I put it at the very end, and that's how I figured out how to like just sort of live with the things that I end with that to say like this book, it took 7 years to make, and it's still very imperfect, right? It's not everything I want, but at some point I had to just stop. Okay. Oh yes, Amy, you're about to say something.
Well, I just wanted to validate that I don't think it's possible to put all of sexuality education in any one book. I mean, even in our whole lives that has 25 or 26 sessions that are 90 minutes long, plus sexuality and our faith, there's still stuff that isn't, it's just not exhaustive. That's why we need all these resources together and lots of conversations.
I think I also would like to thank you for mentioning the time it takes to create resources like this and the background work that nobody ever sees, the conversations that you have and the vetting that you have and the conversation. So thank you for explaining that. I really hope that, I know you wrote this for young people, but I really hope that parents read it, because as you're reading about body autonomy, I was reminded of a parent workshop I once did. Mom came up to me afterwards and said, "How will I know when my son has his first wet dream?" And I said, "Why would it be important for you to know that?"
Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah. And do you remember what she said? Or was she just confused?
Well, she thought it was important that it would guide conversations that she needed to have.
Right.
And I said, go ahead and have the conversations, create the safe space, but you don't need to invade his privacy to that extent. So I think that there are perhaps ways that young people who read your book will be able to say to their parent or their trusted adult, that's not information I feel comfortable sharing.
Yeah, that's the hope. And of course, the thing is, none of us it makes sense that she asked you that question because no one taught her, but no one taught me about body autonomy. And certainly no one ever, I want to distinguish actually, no one used that language.
Right.
So I didn't have the language, right? I think it's very helpful for young people to have the word consent and have the word body autonomy. But nobody even circled it out as like this is a thing worth talking about. So and the answer is yes. I mean, like certainly when parents come to me, I always say you should read my book first before you give it to your kid, because you're going to know if there's a good fit, and also because it's going to make your kid ask you it's going to prompt questions. And the other thing I'll say is just that like adults are constantly, it's a nice thing that they are constantly telling you they learn stuff from the book, which I think is also about comics and it's about kids books, right? That as adults, we're already, we're already like cynical readers. Like we're cynical readers, right? People are always saying like, how are you going to deal with kids? Kids are much more open readers. And so I think there's something about like, even like, so like, you know, in the books, like sex is a funny word gets used in colleges sometimes because there's something about it that just allows adults to take the information in a different way.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, Cory, I know when you wrote What Makes a Baby, you also wrote a parent guide for it.
Yeah.
And is there a parent guide also for Sex is a Funny Word and or You Know Sex?
Not
Or
yet. So
teacher guide or
yeah,
anything
so
like
yeah,
that?
so I'm working on that with Bianca Loriano. So we're working on that for Sex is a Funny Word. I was very I was hopeful. So actually in Sex is a Funny Word, in the introductory letter, I say you can go to my website and get the read your parent guide. It never turned up because I got, well, I mean, life took over. So yes, so I am working on both of those things, and in fact, a curriculum sort of geared towards homeschooling parents and unschooling parents, which is really just, I mean, it's just like a series of questions and ways of pointing out the ways that you can use the book, because there's all sorts of ways to use the book to teach about race and class and gender and capitalism. And that's sometimes not as obvious to parents. So we're working on it, but it's unpaid work, so it goes slowly.
Yeah, so we are validating that
Yes,
all
you
over
know.
the place, yes.
You guys are
But
always
also,
working.
I'm, you know, sorry, a lot of our audience here today is are people who work with youth,
Yeah,
right? And they are youth directors or DREs or, and so I'm thinking that could be a really great resource for them as well.
yeah,
How to use this book to have conversations about all these justice issues that intersect with sexuality that sometimes um, people don't take the time to have those conversations.
yeah.
So important.
Yeah, and the book is sort of written for that. Like, so in that early comic, this white kid is saying to Mimi, and this is an interesting thing because people say, because Fiona draws her characters on all these different colors, and that's just the way she's always drawn her characters. But there's race in the book, and in that scene, there's this white kid that's saying to Mimi, "Aren't you supposed to be good at math?" And Mimi's saying, "I realize you're being racist." We don't pick that up again, right? So it's there for adults and parents and kids to pick up if they want. And so people do use, I mean, often the way people use the book in groups is they'll just read a comic and then they'll just start asking some questions.
Yeah.
And
And then it's so important for parents then to read it, to know what kind of questions they might
yeah,
get asked and to be open to having those conversations. And if they don't know, to find out together more
yeah,
about those
yeah,
things.
yeah. And we do have, before the sexual abuse chapter, that's sort of the only page where we have a page that's basically a content warning. Because this is the other thing, as I mentioned at the beginning, for myself, about being a parent is constantly triggering, is like, it is this very complicated moment where you may have, and you all may, and folks may already have this experience, but if you're newer to this, you may not realize, like, you may have a parent that that sends their kid to an OWL group who has experienced sexual violence, who has never looked at it, who has never had the opportunity to have any therapy, to have any healing, to have any conversation about it, who may in fact not remember it. And so then sometimes this is when it comes up, and it's so hard. Like, you know, you're with your kid and you're trying to do this thing, and all of a sudden you're triggered in a way. So this, I mean, I was aware of that with the second book, but even more with this third book, very much thinking about young kids who are already experiencing sexual violence, because that's the other thing we do often as sex educators, is that we teach to this mythic child who has yet to be bullied, who's yet to experience sexual violence, you know, or racism or anti-Semitism or homophobia, who we teach about these things as if this is something that may happen to you one day, when in fact we know it's already happening to them.
Well, that early panel that you showed about the many ways that young people have already learned about sexuality.
Right.
And sometimes when we do parent orientations for different, most often the younger grades, but even the 7 to 9, parents will say, well, I don't know that my child is ready for this. We want to preserve their innocence. And like, that was gone a long time ago. The minute they started going to the grocery aisles and seeing tabloids or playing video games where there's shoot 'em ups of, you know, female identified or sex worker type characters, you know, their innocence was gone long before we started having this conversation.
Yeah. It's a challenge to get people to refigure that innocence piece. It doesn't make any sense. It's like, I'm not really sure what it means, their innocence. But yes, it is a challenge.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes to just tag on that, I think that a lot of times when parents, when that's their concern, it's really about their own experiences and their own baggage, if you will, that they have around their own sexual experiences and what
Yeah.
was surprising or harmful, or when their bodily autonomy was not respected, or when they found something out in a way that wasn't helpful. So I think that that is sometimes what that conversation is about in my
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
And I love, love, love what you said at the beginning, which is, we've all lived in our bodies our whole lives.
Hmm.
So we have wisdom. We have
Yeah.
wisdom about those bodies, and
Yeah.
coming back to um, allowing and encouraging children and adults to tap that wisdom and
Mhm.
to be in their bodies and to love their bodies as sacred and beloved places where we live, right?
Right.
That is something that I think a lot of times our culture, especially North America, is good at telling people to ignore.
Yeah, and I mean, just what you said. I mean, that is not a message kids get. I mean, that's not a message any of us get. I mean, some of us might get it on Instagram in a meme, but like that beautiful message that you just said about our bodies, they're not telling kids that in school. Um, so and another kind of like thing I want to say about this is why it's also so important about why OWL is so important. Everyone that's on the call that facilitates these groups is so important, because it's very hard for parents to start these conversations, and for me too, because of course we've had to, if you've had your kid in your life for a long time, I've had to keep them alive. I've had to make decisions for them for so long. So then to make that switch to really give kids, like when you said they have wisdom in their bodies, it's hard for parents to accept that their kids have wisdom, because of course their kids are also like making terrible decisions all the time about like, well, I could just eat candy all day, right? So for example, just as one example, or it's okay for me to jump off of this height, when you know that they don't yet know how to jump safely, so they might break their arm. So having adults who can have that role, who can start having these conversations, and that's how I see my books, is that like our role is that we get to kind of lift kids up and we can give kids these tools so they can go back into their homes and communities and they have some tools, because of course the most important conversations, I believe, have to happen with their families, right? That like whatever I tell a kid or however I help a kid, I'm not in their family. So it's like, so I just think it's so like, yeah, I just really appreciate OWL for this reason, because kids get to be in rooms with trusted adults who are not their parents. Maybe sometimes they are actually, but because I'm just thinking of, actually, I know a UU parent who also I think facilitates, but it's just such an important role, because and I think that those of us who do this, who are teachers, can forget. It's just so special, because the other thing is that we also spend time, like parents spend time with their kid and often not many other kids.
Right.
To get to spend an hour and a half every week with a group of kids, you just get this knowledge, you get stuff that allows you to be with kids in a different way. And our kids need that.
Yeah, and that just resonates so much with our tenet of parents are the primary sexuality educators of their kids. I know sometimes when I've done talks at schools and parents are super worried that this whatever sexuality education is happening at school is gonna, wreck their kids or supersede their family values. And I always say, there's nothing that the school can do in a handful of hours in your child's life that's going to supersede 18 years of you and the messages that you're giving.
Right.
The opportunity here, though, is that you can have these conversations together, that you can talk about your values and why you have them, and you can talk about these topics and what's important.
Well, I think also we have, one of the important things that we have to do when we say that is to help parents do that. When I started facilitating our whole lives, the feedback I got after the first 7 to 9 program was, thank God you're talking about this to our kids so we don't have to. And that's when I started doing workshops for parents to facilitate having those conversations. I don't know if you're aware, Cory, this year we introduced Marshall Miller and Dorian Solot created a series of videos for parents of K1 kids called Under Your Wing.
Okay.
And there are 8 of short, like 4 to 7 minute videos that talk about how to have those conversations about conception, bodies, body boundaries, disability, just a real quick primer with some book recommendations. And then we also last year debuted, I think it was last year, Parents and Caregivers as Sexuality Educators, which is a 12-week program. There's a UU version and a UCC version, and they're mostly journaling and then group discussion about, how do I think about these issues? So we're not like, this is chlamydia versus syphilis. Right. It's more like, how do we want to have conversations about sexual health in general? So those are ways that we are trying to support parents. And also we provide curated lists of books and websites, and your books are on those lists. And when I think of your books, I think, man, they would be so suited to video. Have you considered doing?
Yeah, there's talk of some people have asked about that. So it's a big
oh, I know.
Yeah. And
Here's all those ideas for tomorrow. We'll do that tomorrow.
Is this, Amy, did you just share? I was going to ask, those videos, are they publicly available?
Yeah, I'm scrambling here. I posted the wrong link and then I posted the right link, and they're also on the UUA site. I know where they are on the UCC site, so I'm finding those, Melanie, if you want to if you want to find yours as well. But I'm looking up the I'm
aware of the time. So
yes.
Just to say, if people had any, I don't know, I haven't been looking, but if people have any questions.
They've been very grateful to you.
Yes, that's what we've received.
Okay, well, that's good. And also I'll just say, like, people can always reach out if they're looking for other kinds of resources. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to hear from people. They can just contact me.
There is one question really quickly here at the end of our time together. It says, do these books or others address mental health awareness? And I want to say that these are not, I mean, our books, all of our books have threads that are around healthy relationships and healthy sexuality, and also abuse of those things. In terms of mental health as a separate topic, an overarching topic, they aren't meant for that. We do have through UCC resources, and even on Amazon, you can get a resource called Blessed Youth. It's a mental health book and a Blessed Youth survival guide that Reverend Dr. Sarah Lund wrote in the United Church of Christ. I don't know what other resources the UUA might have, but those are two resources that are available.
The UUA, Jennifer Davis Hockett, offers a training in mental health first aid for youth and young adults.
And I'll say that, that our books do. So they name things like depression, and they talk about feelings and like embodied feelings sort of throughout. So there isn't a chapter on mental health. It comes up more in some sections than others, so certainly more in puberty, that we end up having comics where we see, but there's also examples like, there's a comic where we see kids are writing down things on a piece of paper. I can't remember what they're writing down, but kids are talking about, like, they have a sibling that takes medication, or they have a sibling that's had to go to hospital because they've been hurting themselves. So in the same way that, like, throughout, like, the use of cell phones, a big thing for our books is that we want the books to look like kids' lives, right? And kids' lives look like struggle with mental health, because kids, like all of us, struggle with mental health. So it's not made invisible. Part of the harm for me, I don't know harm, but anyway, part of the problem with a lot of traditional sex education is they make everything invisible other than the biomedical aspects of sex. So there isn't anyone struggling to learn something. There isn't anyone struggling to comprehend something. It's all just information that's taken in, and then it somehow miraculously kind of works. So our books definitely don't do that.
So Cory, I wanted to share with folks that the UUA bookstore sells your books. Of course, they're sold everywhere books are sold. Does UCC Resources have Cory's books, Amy?
I believe that we are going to have What Makes It a Baby as part of the new K1 pack that we're going to put together for the K1 storybooks. And I'm working on that. I'm working on getting those other ones together. So
Great.
we will continue to have conversations about that.
Amy's going to, we'll tell you what's coming up next, but I did want to make a plug for the April Taking Flight. We'll focus, our guest will be Dr. Verena Brown. She is a pediatrician who specializes in child sexual abuse and working with parents around important conversations and supporting children who are survivors of that. I know next month we have our publications director from the UUA, and we'll be talking about the upcoming version of K1, which and the new format, which will be, well, we'll talk about it in October, but everybody come to October and learn about the new format. And Amy, would you like to talk about our November program?
Yeah, so October 5th is our next webinar, and then on November 2nd, we're going to have Martha Kempner, who, if you do not know Martha, she is a very witty writer and has a newsletter called Sex on Wednesday, and we thought it would be really lovely to have her on since we do these webinars on Wednesday. So that one will be called Sex on Wednesday. So we hope to see you at our next upcoming Our Whole Lives Taking Flight webinars, and we thank you so much for being with us today. And Cory, just thank you so much for all the work that you do. In my frame, it's a ministry that you provide, and I certainly appreciate that.
Well,
And
thanks.
you're getting all kinds of hearts and
Yes,
congrats and the clapping and thumbs up on the reactions. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks so much for
Thank
having
you.
me.
Bye, everybody.
And do feel free to stay in touch.
Thank you.